So I read a bunch of books in 2022. In fact, I read 100 books. Normally, when I'm reading 50 to 75 books a year, it doesn't seem worth it to count down more than a top 5 books for the year. But with 100, I think it's worth giving some props to my top 10 books of the year. And remember, if you're interested in looking at all of the covers of the 100 books that I've read, you can pause the video here and look at that a little bit. Now, let's look at the top 10. And narrowing it down to the top 10 was not easy. Now, it would be easy for me to pick out my worst books of the year. And I hope it is always that way. I try to read more books from authors that I like and on topics that I like than those that I don't. And I'm not interested in bashing anyone on this video, so I'm going to leave the worst books out. This one is all about the best. I would say if you could put any books on your 2023 reading list, these books should be it. Welcome to Rev Reads, your home for book reviews from the perspective of a pastor. If you are new to the channel and want to discover more of the best Christian books, please subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with my most current reviews. If you're a regular to the channel, like this video, share it with other people to help them get into the wonderful world of reading. Before I begin the top 10, I want to first cover a few that just missed making it. Seculosity by David Zoll was awesome and would be a perfect book to start the new year. It would be my number 11 book. And then these are the others that were close misses. Eternal Security by Charles Stanley was a great presentation of the gospel and assurance. 5 Ways Free Grace Magnifies the Gospel was a thorough and appreciated presentation of the freeness of the gospel. And then I need to mention Lucas Kitchen's Eternal Rewards and a primer on biblical literacy by Marsh. They were very, very good books. Before I get to my top 10, remember, if you want to learn more about any of these books, you can always watch the full review if you're interested in seeing more. You can look at the video descriptions and I'll have links for all of the books that I mention in this video. I was going to present them in no particular order, but then I decided, no, Sean, be brave and give it to them in a particular order. So here is my number 10 book for 2022. It's Calvinism, edited by Allen and Lemke, and then with a bunch of other really great contributors. It was a fantastic critique on Calvinism by a group of quality writers. I think it's a must read, and I'm glad it sold so well that they had trouble keeping it in stock at first. Number 9, God in Eternity and Time by Robert Piccirilli. I just loved reading this book where the author saw the Bible's teaching on how God interacts with us and in time in a similar way that I do, but he describes it and defends it much better than I ever could. So if you want to know why God's foreknowledge does not equal causation, read God in Eternity and Time. The number 8 book, How Does God Draw People to Believe in Jesus? I knew from the title that I would really appreciate this book by Robert Carey, and it was as good as I hoped. It was a great examination of all the ways that God draws people to himself, as well as a quality study on John chapter 6. Just a great book. The number 7 book in the top 10 is the only one I don't have a print version to hold, and it is God Has a Name by John Mark Comer. I love Exodus chapter 36, verses 6 through 7. God's description of himself in these 2 verses, I think, should be as well known as John 3:16. No one can really understand God without a deep dive into these 2 verses. And Comer does a wonderful work first showing how these verses come up again and again and again throughout the Bible, revealing their importance. But it was just so refreshing to read a book that's just covering the goodness of God as presented by God himself. My number 6 book is The Coming Kingdom by Andy Woods. This book is on the list mostly due to its importance. Overall, I believe the church has butchered and ruined the concept of the kingdom. We have an idea of the kingdom that is more based on Platonism than it is on the Old Testament. Woods helps the reader to get back into what the Bible actually says about the kingdom. This is an important work. It is profound. And I'll say it again, this is a very important book. Number 5, Faith and Saving Faith by Gordon Clark. And here is a Calvinist who makes my top 5. This book is so important because Clark helps the reader to see how flawed the church's teachings have been when it comes to the subject of faith. We add works and effort and so much garbage into the concept of faith, and none of it's based on the Bible. So Clark does the work of a soldier in examining the views of past theologians on faith and showing how they are just not scriptural. There's no such thing in the Bible as head faith versus heart faith. We just made all of that up and many other things regarding faith on our own. Number 4, Faith, The Reach of an Empty Hand by James Shupe. So obviously faith is pretty important to me, and it should be to you too. In a world where people pack saving faith with so many works, it's imperative to go back to the fundamentals where faith is reaching out and taking hold of the grace that's offered by Jesus Christ. This book might actually be the one where I disagreed with the author the most times throughout the book. But I highly enjoyed the journey Shoup took me on in his own personal examination of faith. Number 3, Simply by Grace by Charlie Bing. If I had to use a single word to describe this book, it would be delightful. I loved reading Bing's brief description of the grace given to us by Jesus Christ. It was a wonderful, easy to read book that is the perfect way to introduce others to the saving work of Jesus Christ. So applause to Charlie Bing. And my biggest complaint about this book is I wish I would have read it earlier. Number 2, Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace. I ended up using a gauge to decide whether books should be in the top 10, largely based on how often I've recommended them to other people. And I am certain that my top 2 books are easily my most recommended this year. And Wallace's work to show how Jesus was the most influential person in all of human history, it was just awesome. We aren't only resting on the Word of God in order to understand the majesty and the importance of Christ, but Jesus has his fingerprints on every improvement and advancement of society since its coming. This book is just great. It's ideal for teens and adults, highly enjoyable, enlightening, a satisfying read. And I'd also say this is one of those books where you are much better having the physical hard copy than ordering the Kindle edition. So get yourself a paper copy of Person of Interest. And my number 1 book. This is the book where I turned to my wife the most often while I was reading it and said, "Did you know?" Or, "You need to hear about this." And I've also heard from a couple of viewers in response to the review for this book that they had never heard of it before watching the review. And then they purchased it after seeing the review and thought it was excellent. My number 1 book this year is Destroyer of the Gods by Larry Hurtado. I love church history, and this was a great look at how the early church fundamentally changed the world. We ruined the Roman gods, and I also love how it was focused on the earliest descriptions of the church. And that's not those of the early church fathers, but what we find in the Bible itself, as opposed to what we see described hundreds of years later. This book also does a great job at showing how Catholicism is really based on combining Christianity with the very paganism that the church was destroying. This is an excellent, excellent book. So there's my top 10. We'll see if I can read 100 books again next year. Part of me kind of doubts it, but yeah, you never know. If you have any recommendations for me, feel free to comment on this video below and let me know. I might read it and review it. Destroyer of the Gods, my number 10 book, and Seculosity, my 11th book, were both recommended by viewers. I think my viewers on Rev Reads are excellent readers. They're great at recommending books based on what I have read so far. So if you're looking forward to some great reading in 2023, I'd encourage you to join me on Goodreads. If you want to know what I'm currently reading, you could also join the Rev Reads Facebook group as well. And if you'd be interested in supporting the channel financially to help me cover some of the behind the scenes cost, go to buymeacoffee.com/RevReads, become a member, and get entered into a drawing to maybe win some of these books for yourself. But overall, whether you become a member or a subscriber or not, let's all just keep reading in 2023.